The Battle of Manzikert was not a heroic last stand. It was not a battle decided by superior numbers or overwhelming force, and it was not lost because the Byzantine army lacked experience or tradition. It was lost because of decisions. In 1071, the Byzantine Empire was still one of the most sophisticated military powers in the world. It had professional armies, hardened veterans, and centuries of battlefield knowledge behind it. On paper, it should not have failed. But at Manzikert, an empire did not collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because it misunderstood the enemy, misread the battlefield, and trusted the wrong people at the wrong moment. This was not a sudden disaster. It was a slow unraveling, unfolding step by step, choice by choice, until retreat became panic, and panic became irreversible collapse. The Seljuk Turks did not win Manzikert by brute force. They won it by movement, deception, and patience. They allowed the Byzantines to defeat themselves. What makes Manzikert different from most medieval battles is that the decisive moment did not come from a charge or a breakthrough or a heroic counterattack. It came from confusion inside the Byzantine command structure. By the end of the day, Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes would be captured. The Byzantine field army would cease to exist as a coherent force, and Anatolia, the heartland of the empire, would be left open in a way it never recovered from. Manzikert was not just a defeat, it was a strategic turning point that reshaped the balance of power in the Middle East and set the conditions for the Crusades that would follow. This is the story of how one battle, fought far from Constantinople, broke an empire, not through strength, but through error. The Byzantine army that marched toward Manzikert was not weak. It was large, well-equipped, and commanded by an emperor who believed authority itself could hold the field together. But strength on paper does not survive poor structure. Romanos IV Diogenes did not command a single army. He commanded factions forced to stand in the same formation. Veteran Byzantine units stood beside unreliable mercenaries. Frankish knights fought next to Armenian levies who distrusted Constantinople. Turkish auxiliaries were placed where loyalty mattered most, and loyalty failed first. This was not a united force, it was a political compromise wearing armor. Romanos advanced cautiously, believing the Seljuk army under Alp Arslan was smaller and retreating. That assumption was his first mistake. The Seljuks were not retreating, they were dispersing. Instead of meeting the Byzantines head-on, Alp Arslan allowed his cavalry to stretch the battlefield, drawing Romanos deeper, farther from cohesion, farther from control. Seljuk horse archers harassed the Byzantine flanks relentlessly. They did not seek decisive engagement. They sought exhaustion, confusion, and misalignment. Arrows fell, then vanished. Attacks came, then dissolved into open ground. The Byzantine army moved forward, but never together. Romanos made his second fatal decision late in the day. Believing the Seljuks were finally breaking, he ordered a general withdrawal to reorganize. The command was misunderstood. Some units pulled back, others held position, others believed the retreat signaled defeat. At that moment, discipline collapsed, and then came betrayal. Andronicus Ducas, commanding the rear guard and openly hostile to the emperor, did not cover the retreat. He withdrew completely, not tactically, politically. The emperor's army was suddenly split, exposed, and leaderless at its most vulnerable point. Alp Arslan did not hesitate. The Seljuk cavalry turned instantly. What had been a retreat became an encirclement. The Byzantine center, isolated and confused, was cut off. The flanks dissolved. Mercenaries fled. Units fought blindly without orders. This was no longer a battle. It was a system failure. Romanos still fought. He still believed control could be reasserted. But control had already left the field. The army did not lose because it was outmatched. It lost because it no longer obeyed a single will. By sunset, the Byzantine force that had marched with confidence now existed only as fragments, scattered, fleeing, or surrounded. And the emperor was still in the center of it. The moment Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was captured, the Battle of Manzikert stopped being a battle and became a collapse. Not a slow defeat, not a heroic last stand, a sudden, irreversible loss of control. Until that moment, the Byzantine army was still technically intact. Units were scattered, confused, partially engaged, but the structure of command still existed. Orders could still be given. Retreat was still possible. Survival, while unlikely, was not yet impossible. That illusion ended the instant the emperor fell. Romanos was not captured in a dramatic charge or surrounded by elite guards. He was isolated, wounded, and abandoned by the very system he commanded. As the battle dissolved into chaos, his personal guard thinned, units peeled away, and allies failed to respond, not because they could not, but because they chose not to. When Seljuk soldiers seized him, there was no symbolic clash of emperors, no declaration, no recognition of status, only the quiet, brutal reality that the man holding the empire together was now gone. And with him, command vanished. Byzantine warfare depended on centralized authority. Orders flowed downward from the emperor. Strategy, timing, and cohesion all relied on his presence. Once Romanos disappeared from the field, no officer had both the legitimacy and the information needed to take control. What followed was not pursuit, it was disintegration. Units that believed the emperor was dead began retreating on their own. Others, unaware of the capture, continued fighting without coordination. Some turned on fellow soldiers, mistaking them for enemies in the growing confusion. The battlefield fractured into isolated pockets of fear. There was no unified retreat, no controlled withdrawal, only movement away from danger. This was not simply a military failure, it was a psychological one. Byzantine soldiers were trained to fight within structure. When that structure collapsed, discipline collapsed with it. Courage became irrelevant, training became useless. Individual survival replaced collective purpose. The Seljuks did not need to annihilate the Byzantine army. They only needed it to let it fall apart. Romanos, meanwhile, was brought before Alp Arslan, not as a conquered symbol, but as a living consequence of strategic miscalculation. The capture of an emperor was rare. The capture of an emperor whose own army had already unraveled was something else entirely. This was the moment the Byzantine Empire lost more than a battle. It lost credibility, it lost cohesion, it lost control of Anatolia, not through immediate occupation, but through the absence of resistance that followed. Manzikert did not destroy the Byzantine army in a single day, but it removed the one thing the empire could not survive without: the ability to act as a unified force. From this point forward, every defense would be weaker, every frontier more vulnerable, every internal conflict more dangerous. The empire still existed on paper, but on that field, command died. Manzikert did not end with the capture of an emperor. It ended with the collapse of control. What followed was not an immediate conquest, not a single decisive invasion, but something far more dangerous: a vacuum. Romanos IV was released. The empire still existed. Constantinople still stood, but authority was gone. The Byzantine state had survived defeats before, even catastrophic ones. What it could not survive was internal fracture at the exact moment its frontier was exposed. Romanos returned to an empire that no longer recognized him. The court moved against him, civil war erupted, and while Byzantines fought Byzantines, Anatolia was left undefended. That was the true consequence of Manzikert, not the loss of a battle, but the loss of time. The Seljuks did not need to launch a massive invasion. They did not need to besiege cities or defeat field armies. They simply moved. Turkmen bands poured into Anatolia gradually, quietly, without resistance. Not as conquerors at first, but as settlers. They took grazing lands, they took villages, they took roads, and no one stopped them. Byzantium still had walls, still had cities, still had soldiers, but it no longer had coordination. The frontier system collapsed. Local commanders acted independently or not at all. Supplies failed to reach garrisons. Orders contradicted each other. Anatolia, once the empire's heartland, became porous. What made this irreversible was not military inferiority, but political paralysis. Every year spent in civil war was a year the Seljuks did not need to fight. They advanced without battles. They expanded without sieges. They won without resistance. By the time Constantinople understood what was happening, the damage was already structural. The tax base of Anatolia was gone. The recruitment pool was gone. The logistical backbone of the Byzantine army was gone. Manzikert did not destroy Byzantium immediately. It crippled its ability to recover. Within a generation, Anatolia, Greek-speaking, Christian, Roman for centuries, was transformed, not by force alone, but by absence. And this is why Manzikert matters, because it proves that empires do not fall when armies lose battles. They fall when leadership collapses and space is left unguarded. Romanos IV lost control of a moment. Byzantium lost a continent. And once Anatolia was lost, the empire would spend the next 4 centuries retreating until there was nowhere left to retreat to.
Manzikert matters because it was not decided by numbers, bravery, or even superior tactics in isolation. It was decided by control, and more importantly, by the loss of control at the worst possible moment. Manzikert teaches us that an army can survive defeat. An empire cannot survive confusion at the top. Romanos IV did not lose because his soldiers were cowards. He lost because command fractured, loyalty evaporated, and decisions were made without trust. The Seljuks did not win by overwhelming force. They won by forcing the Byzantines to fight without clarity, stretching their command structure until it snapped. This lesson remains brutally modern. In any military system, ancient or modern, coordination matters more than courage, and unity matters more than numbers. An army that cannot communicate clearly, cannot trust its leadership, and cannot adapt to uncertainty will collapse from the inside, no matter how strong it appears on paper. Manzikert also warns against a dangerous illusion that a single decisive victory can solve structural problems. Romanos IV believed defeating Alp Arslan would stabilize the empire. But empires do not collapse because of one loss. They collapse because that loss reveals weaknesses that were already there. Internal rivalry, political sabotage, commanders more loyal to factions than to the battlefield. These were not created at Manzikert. They were exposed there. For modern military planners, Manzikert reinforces a critical truth. No external enemy is as dangerous as internal division during combat. It also shows how flexibility beats rigidity. The Seljuks adapted constantly, retreating, probing, exhausting the enemy, while Byzantine doctrine relied on order, formation, and predictable responses. When order failed, nothing replaced it. And perhaps the most enduring lesson of all is psychological. The capture of an emperor shattered belief. Not belief in victory, but belief in the system itself. Once soldiers no longer believed the empire could protect its own ruler, they no longer believed it could protect Anatolia. That psychological fracture opened the door long before Turkish settlers ever crossed it. Manzikert still matters because it reminds us that wars are not only fought on maps and battlefields, they are fought inside command structures, inside political systems, and inside the minds of those who serve them. An empire can recover from losses. It cannot recover from the moment when its own people stop believing in it. That is why Manzikert was not just a defeat, it was the beginning of the end.
Manzikert did not end the Byzantine Empire in a single afternoon, but it ended something far more important, the illusion that control could be maintained through authority alone. What collapsed that day was not an army, but coherence. Orders lost meaning, loyalty dissolved under pressure, and when the emperor was taken, the system built around him simply stopped functioning. The Seljuks did not need to destroy Byzantium outright. They only needed to prove that it could be broken. From that moment on, Anatolia was no longer a secure imperial heartland. It became contested space, militarily, culturally, and demographically. A slow transformation began, one that no later reform, campaign, or crusade could fully reverse. Manzikert reminds us that wars are not always decided by superior numbers or better weapons. They are decided by clarity of command, unity of purpose, and the ability to adapt when the plan fails. An empire can survive defeat. What it cannot survive is confusion at the center. That is why Manzikert still matters, not as a dramatic legend, but as a warning. A warning that the most dangerous moment in any conflict is not when the enemy advances, but when leaders lose control of their own decisions.
If you value history, told through strategy, psychology, and the decisions that shape outcomes, this is what Du Lu Memoirs exists for. Here, battles are not myths, they are case studies. Subscribe if you want to understand why wars are lost, not just how they are fought. Because the past does not repeat itself, but its mistakes are always available to those who refuse to learn from them. Thank you for watching, and this was Du Lu Memoirs.